What if I told you that 14 centuries ago, in the vast deserts of Arabia, a man foretold the collapse of one of the greatest empires in human history, and that every single word unfolded exactly as he declared? This isn't the script of a historical drama, nor a faded legend buried in ancient scrolls. It is a documented reality, a living miracle, and one of the countless undeniable proofs of the truthfulness of the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad. While the world today debates prophecies, predictions, and so-called clairvoyance, the words of Rasul Allah stand unmatched. Words that not only described the unseen, but unveiled entire eras of the future with divine clarity. His tongue spoke not from guesswork or illusion, but from wahi, revelation. And among the many nations and powers he spoke about, one stands out in its magnificence and its fall. Persia, known today as Iran. This land was once the heart of an empire so vast, so powerful, and so proud that no one could have imagined it falling. But it did, just as foretold. And today, as you hear this story, you will not just be listening to history. You will be witnessing a miracle unfold, word by word, event by event. The world one far stored 100 years ago was not like ours. It was a time where kings ruled with iron fists and divine arrogance. The Roman Empire ruled the West, the Abyssinians in Africa, and in the East there stood the unmatched grandeur of the Persian Empire. Persia wasn't just a country, it was a symbol of legacy. Its cities glowed with palaces layered in gold. Its libraries preserved the wisdom of ages. Its kings, especially Khusrow Parvez, were worshipped by their people as godlike figures. His throne, known as the Takhtis, towered over the capital, Ctesiphon, like a crown upon the earth. His courts sparkled with jewels. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and his influence stretched from the banks of the Tigris to the edges of Central Asia. People trembled at his command. Rulers bowed before him. He was the King of Kings, and he believed that nothing, no one could challenge his authority. But far from the towering halls of Ctesiphon, in the humble city of Madain, a man who had never read from a scroll, never sat in a royal court, and had never been taught by human hands, was being taught by the Lord of the worlds. That man was Muhammad. When the Prophet began to spread the message of Islam, he didn't keep it confined to Arabia. He sent letters to the rulers of the world, not just to warn them, but to invite them with dignity, with peace, and with truth. One such letter was addressed to Khusrow Parvez, the Shahanshah of Persia. The letter was simple in words, but powerful in meaning. Accept Islam, and you will be safe. Allah will give you double the reward. But it began with a sentence that pierced the king's ego. From Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, to Khosrow, the emperor of Persia. For a man who saw himself as a god among men, this was unforgivable. How dare this Arab, this man with no empire, put his name before mine? In his fury, Khosrow tore the letter to pieces. That act of arrogance would echo in eternity. When news of what Khosrow did reached the Prophet, he made no threats. He issued no army. He simply said, with full conviction, "May Allah tear his kingdom the way he tore my letter." That statement, those few words, were not just a response. They were a prophecy that would not take centuries to fulfill. It would begin unfolding within months. Khosrow, the most powerful man in the East, had unknowingly signed the death sentence of his own throne, not at the hands of an enemy, but through the certainty of a prophet whose every word came from the heavens. And the story was only just beginning. The day the letter from Prophet Muhammad reached the court of Khusrow Parvez, the grand halls of Persia echoed with drums of formality, glittered with gold, and stood as a proud symbol of an empire that had dominated for centuries. Courtiers, generals, and viziers filled the throne room as the royal scribe read aloud the parchment. It was no ordinary message. It was an invitation from the final messenger of Allah, a call to abandon falsehood and embrace the eternal truth of Islam. But for Khusrow Parvez, a man who had been worshipped by his people, who believed himself to be the shadow of God on earth, the words written on that letter struck at the core of his pride. How could a man from the barren deserts of Arabia, a land the Persians had long looked down upon, address him directly? How could he dare place his name before that of the Shahanshah, the King of Kings? To Khusrow, it was a humiliation. In a moment of blinding arrogance, he rose from his throne and tore the letter to shreds with his own hands, declaring with scorn that the man who sent this must be deluded or insane. His fury was not just political, it was personal. He felt insulted, dishonored, challenged, but he did not know that what he had just torn apart was not ink on paper. It was a sacred call. And by shredding it, he had not insulted a man, but had enraged the Lord of the worlds. News of this disrespect did not take long to reach Medina. When it did, the prophet, with the calm of divine certainty, responded not with retaliation, but with revelation. He said, as he tore my letter, may Allah tear apart his kingdom. No messengers sent, no war declared, just a statement, soft in voice, but thundering in impact. And as history would bear witness, those words would unleash a chain of events that no army could resist, no walls could block, and no empire could escape. Because when a prophet speaks by the will of Allah, the universe itself moves to fulfill it. Khosrow, still burning with anger, did not stop at tearing the letter. He ordered the governor of Yemen, Madain, who was under Persian rule at the time, to send men to arrest the prophet and bring him to the Persian court in chains. Imagine the pride and delusion to believe he could summon the messenger of Allah as if he were a rebellious subject. Madain, obeying orders, dispatched 2 of his trusted officers to travel across the deserts and reach Medina. When they arrived, they found not a palace, not guards, not golden thrones, but a humble, peaceful man whose presence radiated a strength they could not comprehend. They requested an audience with the prophet. He asked them to return the next day. They had no idea that by the time they returned, their entire understanding of reality would change forever. That night, in the quiet hours before dawn, the prophet was informed through revelation of something extraordinary, something that had just occurred hundreds of miles away in the heart of the Persian palace. When the 2 officers came back the next day, the prophet looked at them and said, "Go back to your master and tell him that his Khosrow was killed last night by his own son." The officers were stunned. This was not possible. How could a man living in distant Medina know what had transpired in the secret chambers of the Persian court? There was no way news could travel that fast. And yet, the prophet spoke with full conviction, as if he had seen it with his own eye. Baffled, the officers returned to Yemen and relayed the message to Madain. Weeks passed, and then a royal letter arrived from Persia. The seal was broken, and the words confirmed what the prophet had foretold. Khosrow had indeed been assassinated by his own son, Shiri. The unthinkable had happened. The King of Kings had fallen, not in battle, not by foreign sword, but at the hands of his own flesh and blood. And the man who had foretold it was no ordinary human. Upon hearing this, Madain, the governor of Yemen, was struck with awe. He gathered his people and declared with conviction, "This cannot be the knowledge of a mere mortal. Muhammad is truly a messenger of Allah." Not only did Madain embrace Islam, but the entire region of Yemen, once a Persian province, now entered the fold of Islam willingly. No war, no invasion, just truth that had revealed itself through prophecy. But the fall of Khosrow was not just the death of a man. It was the beginning of the unraveling of an empire. After his assassination, chaos consumed Persia. Rulers came and went like falling stars, each one weaker, more unstable, more corrupt than the last. Civil unrest grew. Assassinations became common. The once proud Sassanid dynasty that had ruled for centuries began to rot from the inside. As the prophet continued to call humanity to Islam, The once mighty empire that had torn his message was tearing itself apart. Its armies demoralized, its throne unstable, its people in confusion. Persia was collapsing, not by swords or sieges, but by the weight of a divine decree. And so, with just a letter and a prayer, the prophecy of the prophet began to manifest. What looked like a mere diplomatic insult turned out to be the turning point in the history of nations. Khosrow's arrogance destroyed his empire. The prophet's truth elevated his message, and the world would never be the same again. After the fall of Khusrow Parvez, the empire he once ruled began to tremble like a tower built on sand. One by one, successors took the throne, but none could wear the crown with stability. Some ruled for months, others only for days. Plots were formed, daggers were drawn, and palace halls once filled with royal decrees now echoed with conspiracies and betrayal. The great Persian Empire, which for centuries had dazzled the world with its military might, its architectural splendor, and its scholarly achievements, was now bleeding from within. The throne of Persia had become a cursed seat, where each new ruler knew he might not survive long enough to sleep on it twice. The divine warning was no longer a distant threat, it had materialized. What the Prophet Muhammad had prophesied after Khosrow tore the letter was unfolding step by step. The lion had roared, and now the empire was crumbling beneath its own weight. Meanwhile, in Arabia, a new force was quietly gathering. But this was not a force of worldly ambition. It was not an empire rising for wealth, nor a people hungry for domination. It was a movement shaped by faith, carried by sincerity, and led by men whose hearts beat only for the pleasure of Allah. After the passing of the Prophet, the leadership of the Muslim Ummah passed into the hands of his closest companion, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. The entire Arabian Peninsula was in turmoil. Apostasy movements had risen. False prophets had declared themselves, and tribal loyalties were threatening to tear apart the unity that Islam had forged. But Abu Bakr stood firm with steel-like faith. He crushed the rebellions, re-established the authority of Islam across Arabia, and brought back the light of unity to a region drowning in chaos. Once the internal threats were subdued, Abu Bakr turned his eyes beyond the borders. He did not see land or thrones. He saw the duty of dawah, the call to spread the message of Allah to the nations still drowning in ignorance and oppression. Persia was no longer the undefeatable beast it once was. Its military strength was eroded, its people were exhausted, and its leadership was unstable. Abu Bakr sensed that the time had come. The words of the Prophet about the fall of Persia were still fresh in the hearts of the believers, and so Abu Bakr made a decision that would change the course of history. He summoned the sword of Allah, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the man who had never lost a battle, whose courage made even seasoned generals tremble. Khalid was dispatched toward the Persian frontier, not with arrogance, but with a mission to open the doors of truth to a people long lost in the darkness of fire worship and royal pride. As Khalid marched with small mobile units into the edge of Persia, the contrast was stark. On one side were humble warriors, dressed in simple garments, their wealth in their hearts, their treasure in their belief. On the other side were Persian fortresses, brimming with gold, armies armed with elephants and intricate weapons, and soldiers trained in the finest arts of war. Yet, wherever the Muslims set foot, victory followed. Not because of numbers or equipment, but because their cause was just, their hearts were sincere, and the unseen help of Allah was with them. Cities began to fall. Persian garrisons surrendered. The people were witnessing something they had never seen before. An army that fought by day and wept in prayer by night. An army that took no pride in spoils but cried for the souls they were trying to save. This was only the beginning. The Muslims, still vastly outnumbered, began to chip away at the Persian domains in Iraq. Towns once thought impenetrable were now witnessing the banners of Islam flying above their gates. But the Muslims did not force Islam upon anyone. They offered the same invitation that the Prophet had offered Khusrow. Accept Islam and live in peace, or retain your religion and pay the Qadisiyyah as protection under the Islamic State. It was a message of justice and mercy. a stark contrast to the oppression many Persians had faced under the crumbling Sassanid regime. Back in Medina, as the victories grew and the call of Islam reached new ears, Abu Bakr was reaching the end of his time. But he had prepared for the next phase. Upon his passing, leadership passed to Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man of towering presence, unmatched vision, and iron resolve. Where Abu Bakr laid the foundation, Umar would build the fortress. Under his rule, the push into Persia became not a campaign, but a revolution. It was not a war for conquest, but a war for truth, a divine mission to complete the prophecy that had begun with a torn letter. And so, with the command of Umar and the leadership of brilliant generals like Sa'id ibn Abi Waqqas, the Muslims prepared to face the might of what was left of the Persian Empire. The world watched in disbelief. Could a people so simple, so recently united, really challenge a civilization that had reigned for centuries? But history once again was about to witness that numbers mean nothing when hearts are united by truth. And when destiny moves at the command of Allah, Persia, the empire that once dismissed Islam with mockery, was about to witness the strength of a faith that knew no fear. And the prophecy, once whispered in the heat of the desert, was now thundering across the gates of empire. The sun blazed above the plains of Qadisiyyah, a once quiet stretch of land in present-day Iraq that was destined to become one of the most significant battlefields in the history of mankind. On one side stood the remnants of the mighty Sassanid Empire, an empire bruised but not yet broken, its forces vast and its generals seasoned in the art of. They came not just with swords and spears, but with war elephants armored for destruction, their tusks sharpened and their backs mounted with archers. Their generals wore gold and silk, symbols of centuries of imperial dominance. Among them stood Rostam Farrokhzad, the empire's most revered commander, a man famed for both his military brilliance and his pride. He was Persia's final hope, a wall between survival and complete collapse. On the other side stood an army that would be considered ragged by worldly standards, Muslims led by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a man hand-picked by the Khalifa Umar and a close companion of the Prophet Muhammad. Sa'd, though ill at the time, led from a rooftop, commanding with strategy, prayer, and firm faith. His soldiers had no elephants, no massive fortresses, and no dazzling treasures. What they had was far more powerful: the belief that they were carrying the light of truth. Every soldier knew they were not fighting for land or riches. They were fighting to deliver the same message the Prophet had once sent in a letter that had been torn but whose words still marched, sword in one hand and Quran in the other. The Battle of Qadisiyyah lasted for 4 grueling days. The ground trembled under the charge of elephants, the sky darkened with arrows, and the air filled with war cries and Quranic recitation. The Persians fought with all the fury of an empire defending its very soul, but the Muslims countered with a force drawn from prayer, fasting, and the tears shed in the darkness of night. When the elephants initially charged, the Muslim ranks were shaken, but they adapted quickly, targeting the eyes of the beasts, sowing panic within the enemy's strongest asset. It was not brute strength that turned the tide. It was courage guided by conviction. On the final day, a sandstorm blew across the battlefield, blinding both armies. Yet the Muslims continued to advance. In the midst of chaos, a decisive moment occurred. Rostam, the legendary Persian commander, was struck down and killed. The Sassanid forces, seeing their leader fall, descended into confusion and fled in disarray. Qadisiyyah had fallen, and with it the backbone of Persian military resistance. The Muslims had achieved the unthinkable. The banner of Tawheed now fluttered where once the emblems of fire-worshipping kings had reigned. This was not just a victory of armies, it was a victory of prophecy. The fall of Persia, once unimaginable, was becoming a lived reality. The very empire that had torn the letter of Rasulullah was being torn apart, battle by battle, city by city, soul by soul. But the Muslims didn't stop at Qadisiyyah. The next great target lay ahead: Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persian Empire. It wasn't just any city, it was the throne of Khusrow Parvez, the symbol of Persian supremacy. It was here that the famed Khusrow stood, its massive arch stretching across the sky like a crown upon the city. Beneath that arch, Khosrow had once sat in arrogance, mocking the message of Islam. Now his throne was empty, his heirs either dead or scattered, and the doors of Ctesiphon trembled under the march of believers. As Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and his army approached, the Persians destroyed the bridges across the Tigris River, hoping to halt their advance. But the Muslims, undeterred, crossed the river using makeshift rafts and even swimming across, armor and all, with horses by their side. This crossing was legendary. Soldiers would later describe how it felt as if angels were pushing them across the water. When they reached the other side, they found a city abandoned in fear. The Persian royal family had fled. The soldiers left behind either surrendered or were nowhere to be found. Ctesiphon, the jewel of the Sassanid crown, had fallen without resistance. It was a moment soaked in divine symbolism. The same city where the prophet's letter was torn was now under the leadership of those who had lived by every word of that message. And what the Muslims found inside left them in awe. Gold-studded walls, silk-draped halls, thrones encrusted with diamonds and emeralds, treasures that entire civilizations would envy. Among the most notable was the legendary Qadisiyyah, the peacock throne, an enormous seat of royalty adorned with countless gems, a throne that had once symbolized the unshakable pride of Persia. There was also a robe woven entirely from gold thread, so precious that it was said to be priceless, and yet the Muslim soldiers wept, not out of greed or amazement, but out of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that Allah had fulfilled his promise, and fear that this wealth might test them more than the battle ever had. When these treasures reached Medina, caravans of camels were needed to carry the endless loads of gold, silver and jewels. Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab watched silently as the wealth was poured before him. Tears rolled down his face. He raised his hands and said, "O Allah, you tested the people who came before us with this, and they failed. I ask you to protect us from it." He did not keep a single coin for himself. He did not hand it to his family. Every piece was taken to the Bayt al-Mal, the public treasury of the Muslims. This was not a conquest, it was a cleansing. A land once built on arrogance, idolatry and tyranny was now being purified by justice, humility and light. And yet, even as the capital fell, the Muslims did not oppress. They did not enslave, they did not demolish homes or burn temples. They allowed the Persians to retain their culture, to practice their beliefs under protection, and even to thrive, so long as they lived under the banner of justice. The enemies they had fought yesterday were now their neighbors. The spoils they had gained were now returned to the service of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. The throne was down, the palace emptied, the fire temple silenced. The letter had been torn, but its message had survived, and now it sat upon the very seat once ruled by those who had mocked it. The prophecy of Muhammad was no longer just something believed, it was something seen, something touched, something undeniable. And the world, watching from east and west, began to understand that this was no ordinary rise, this was the unfolding of divine destiny. Even after the fall of Ctesiphon and the capture of its unimaginable treasures, the final curtain had not yet closed on the once mighty Persian Empire. A wounded beast may be dying, but its tail still swings. Yazdegerd III, the last emperor of the Sassanid dynasty, fled in desperation from one city to another, from Ctesiphon to Hulwan, then to Hamadan, then to Nishapur, and finally to Balkh. But no matter how far he ran, the shadow of prophecy pursued him. Each city he reached, he found panic, collapse, and fear. His loyal forces dwindled, his allies abandoned him. His royal garments now weighed heavier than his soul, for they reminded him not of glory, but of a throne long lost. The man who was once a living symbol of imperial pride now moved through his own empire like a fugitive, no longer a ruler, but a reminder of a past that had no future. Meanwhile, the Muslim armies, steady and disciplined, did not chase for revenge or conquest, but to ensure that oppression would never rise again in that land. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas had already established justice and peace. in the heart of the empire, and others like Noman ibn Mukarim and Abdullah ibn Amir were pressing on toward the final cities that held out under Yazdegerd's crumbling rule. Battle after battle, fort after fort, the empire that had stood for over 400 years was unraveling, not because of fire or flood, but because Allah's promise was being fulfilled in plain sight. And then came the final moment. Yazdegerd, now abandoned by even his most trusted commanders, took refuge in the mill of a poor man. The one who was once wrapped in robes of silk, who drank from goblets of emerald and gave orders to entire armies, was now begging for protection in the corner of a flour mill. And in that final moment of despair, his life ended at the hands of a commoner. No army, no throne, no burial of state, no royal procession. The last emperor of Persia died alone, nameless and forgotten by his own people. It was over. The prophecy that began with a torn letter had reached its full completion. The empire that mocked the messenger had been dismantled by the command of the one who sent him. But here's the miracle that the world did not expect. Islam didn't just conquer Persia, it transformed it. The very land that once worshipped fire, that once crowned kings with divine arrogance, became a center of Islamic knowledge, wisdom and culture. The same soil that bore emperors now gave birth to scholars, saints and students of sacred knowledge. Persia, instead of resisting, embraced the truth with a depth and sincerity that would astonish. From its valleys emerged some of the greatest names in the Islamic intellectual tradition: Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam Tirmidhi, Imam Nasai, giants of hadith, all with Persian roots. The fire temples fell, and in their place rose madrasas. The poets of royal courts were replaced by the poets of divine love. People like Rumi, Hafiz, and Sa'di, who blended Persian eloquence with Quranic light. And the people who once bowed to emperors now bowed only to Allah. This was not the end of Persia, it was its rebirth. A rebirth that gave the Ummah centuries of service, oceans of knowledge, and legacies that continue to shape the Muslim world even today. Persia became not a conquered land, but a torchbearer of Islam. And among the earliest signs of this transformation was a man whose story the Prophet once praised, Salman al-Farsi. He was born in the heart of Persia, raised among fire worshippers, but driven by a hunger for truth, so intense that he abandoned everything. His journey led him from the temples of Zoroastrianism to the monasteries of Christianity and finally to the blessed city of Medina, where he met the messenger himself. The Prophet did not treat him as an outsider. He embraced him, honored him, and declared, "Salman is from my al-Bayt, my family." Through Salman's journey, we are reminded that truth is not tied to race, region, or background. It is tied only to the heart that seeks it. And as centuries passed, the prophecy of the Prophet became not just a historical claim, but a living testimony. Today, as we walk through the cities of modern Iran, as we open books of hadith compiled by Persian scholars, as we hear the echoes of Islamic civilization across its language and literature, we see with our own eyes the fulfillment of that divine promise. Persia did not vanish. It was never humiliated. It was lifted, not by the might of armies, nor the weight of crowns, but by the light of divine guidance. And that is the greatest miracle of all, that an empire built on pride crumbled, and in its place rose a people of humility, knowledge, and sincerity. The story of Persia stands as a timeless reminder. No throne is too mighty to fall, no king too powerful to be humbled, and no nation too distant to be guided. When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke, he did not speak from distance. It was revelation, truth sent down from above the heavens. Every word he uttered about empires or individuals, about deserts or dynasties, has come true and will continue to come true until the end of time. This is more than history. This is a sign that Islam is not built on myths or legends, but on miracles engraved into the pages of time. A sign that we belong to a living ummah, one that has seen kings rise and fall, yet still carries the banner of truth high. And most importantly, a sign that the words of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam are not to be merely recited. They are to be believed, treasured, and lived. The text has been punctuated